actually really sad. Like, I think about it a lot. Isn't that really like wild? I literally think about my dead podcast so much. It is my Roman Empire.
Dear listeners, we are gathered here today to reflect on a podcast that is no longer with us, What the World Thinks. The podcast was described as a space for people to find reassurance and new ways of thinking. Haunting us today is its host, Samantha Hornsby. Launched in 2020, 23 episodes were published in total before the show was left to perish after just a year. On this episode, we'll learn what caused What the World Thinks to be yet another headstone in the podcast graveyard. We'll celebrate the highs, lament the lows, and discuss whether it should be laid to rest forever or be brought back to life. From One Fine Play, this is Podcast Graveyard. Hi Sam, thanks for haunting the show today.
Honestly, it's an honour to be here.
So tell me, why did you want to make this podcast?
Oh my God. Okay. Wow. It was lockdown, I think is the first thing to know. So me and literally everyone else in lockdown decided to launch a podcast. It had nothing to do with my job. So I basically, it was like a thing that I did on the side, right? It was like a kind of personal project. I found it really interesting how everyone was like united by this single experience that we were all going through, and we were all talking about the ways we think it would change the world, you know, the ways that we think it would change the way that we live, like the way that we, you know, it would change the interactions between us, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no one's recording any of these conversations. Like no one's recording all of these perspectives, these thoughts. And like, I guess for me, most interestingly, the predictions of how it will change the world. And so I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to get everyone to send in recordings, voice notes on WhatsApp of like how they think that the pandemic is going to change the way that we live moving forward. And I'm just going to cut them all into a little podcast and then release it. And I did that a number of times. And it was interesting. I loved it.
I really enjoy the ingenuity and creativity of the podcast, the recordings on WhatsApp being sent in and you not being the whole show and it not being an interview show. That's kind of original and different and goes against the grain. It's what I would call creatively brave. What kind of expectations did you have when you started the podcast? Were you hoping to achieve something?
I think everyone who starts a podcast, right, starts it being like, oh my God, I can like imagine everyone listening to this.
That is so true. So true.
And so I think I was like, I'm definitely envisaging that it would take off. When it didn't, I equally wasn't surprised because I was like, actually, it's a very saturated area. There are a lot of people, especially in the time that I started it in. I think that, you know, that lockdown period of podcasts, you know, being started was so rife. Like it was, I mean, everyone was starting a podcast. So I think I had such high hopes and then they were quite quickly dashed.
I do really appreciate your honesty of that delusion of, oh, well, I think it's interesting, and therefore everyone's going to think it's interesting.
I mean, I'm quite a delusional person in general, so that's actually not surprising.
Did you pin any hopes on it, or was it just very much a let's get started and see what happens kind of thing?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think I basically used to go to the like London podcast festival. And I think in my head, I had this image of me on stage one day doing my live podcast. So I think I did have a high hope of that. That image was definitely in my head.
And it was during podcast season when there was no other way of making content really because you couldn't get out and about. So yeah, I'll start a podcast. That's easy, right? It's just talking.
That's literally it. Yeah. I was like, oh God, how hard can it be, right? It turns out very hard, very time consuming, and really not good for someone with an ADHD personality like me.
So how much time did you put into it, do you think?
Oh, I did put in a hefty amount of time.
So the time, I'm guessing, was in the curation and the collection of other people's recordings and the outreach to try and get people to send you stuff. Is that right? Is that where most of the time went?
Yes. So I basically used to be a video editor. That was me in a previous life. So my standards are high, I would say, for like edited content. And I also, like, alongside this, I'm obsessed with podcast sound design. I really think it can transform a listening experience, by which I mean like the fading in and out, the music behind it. Like you can make things a lot more emotional with like good sound design. And so those two things combined meant that I was spending a lot of time on the edit and like tweaking things around, sending it to people, being like, what do you think of this? Like, should I make this shorter? Should I make it longer? They were actually quite short as well. They were all under 15 minutes. So like, I mean, I spent a lot of time.
It's interesting though, because those are two things that most people naturally don't go towards at the beginning. One is the interview show is the thing that most people do. And the second is sound design and structure and sound bed and all the things that go around it. Most people take for granted. Just imagine, they happen by magic, I think.
Yeah.
And I know from running a production company that very little respect is given to those kinds of details. And people go, how did that take you half a day?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't just magic itself. So it sounds like you really went for it, especially at the beginning and the time allocation. What about money? Did you spend any money at all?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I spent.
You did?
Not lots, but like you have to basically. I used a platform called Simplecast to upload everything. So I just uploaded everything to Simplecast, and then it would automatically put whatever I'd put on Simplecast across all of the different platforms. So it was like a way of me spreading it out as much as possible with as little effort. But that is like 20 quid a month, I think. And also the Premiere Pro stuff, like, because I was editing on Premiere rather than like, anything else. Like I probably ended up spending about like 40 quid on it every month, but then that went on for a really long time. So like if I wanted to keep the podcast up there, I would have to keep paying Simplecast. And so the £20 a month was coming out of my bank account for probably about 2 years after I stopped doing the podcast. So I forked out a hefty amount, I would say, considering that the podcast is now in the graveyard.
What was the biggest obstacle you faced when making the podcast?
The editing, 100%. But then the other thing as well is collecting if you are collecting voice notes from, let's say, 20 different people, they're then like, how are you going to credit me in the podcast? So you have to collect information about those 20 people. And the admin of that is so annoying. Like that's the fiddly bit.
So it's not the contribution, it's the admin around the contribution.
Yeah. Like literally, I can't be bothered to list everyone's names out, what their job titles are. They're like, can you put in my Instagram link? Sure. But really annoying. Like I can't be bothered with that drama. My God. I'm lazy when it comes to that kind of stuff.
And kind of exciting that you mention editing, because obviously, typically lots of people cut out the editorial as part of their podcast process when they're starting out. They just make something, record it, post it.
Yeah.
Did you underestimate the editing, or what would you say the biggest learning from that was?
I don't think I underestimated it. I just thought that I would enjoy it more than I did. I think that was the difference. I thought I was going to look forward to putting a Saturday aside every week and editing it. And the reality of it was that I was like, this is such a chore. Like, I'm not in the mood to do it. I can't be bothered, Oh my God. And also everyone starts pestering you as well, being like, when's it coming out? And you're like, oh fuck, I haven't done it. Oh my God.
I can empathize with that entirely. What are some of the most embarrassing or cringeworthy stories that you have from making the podcast? Not necessarily from the content, but from the whole process.
I do have I actually do have one kind of continuous thing that kept happening. People kept sending me really boring voice notes that I was like, I cannot include these. And so I had to keep sending people emails being like, so sorry, I'm actually not putting out your episode after all. And just like basically pretending that like it was another reason when it was actually like, you're just really boring.
So did you just lie to them?
Well, I basically kind of, it wasn't a lie. It was like I wasn't really telling them exactly what was going on.
Such an interesting point you make, because we see this in interview-based podcasts a lot, where people don't do research and they'll just take any old guest and they let the guest control the episode because they just sort of act as a question asker in the podcast. And then guests go off at a tangent. I find the apathy and the sort of general just I'll agree with anything my guest says mindset of podcast hosts super frustrating, because you don't get that continual narrative and those constants of beliefs or opinions through multiple episodes. And a lot of that is because someone hasn't done enough research on their guest, and then they feel that they have to put out their episode because the person gave them time and they don't have other options. And so then they're putting out something that they don't really believe in, because that whole situation of having to say, so I'm not actually going to put this one out is really awkward.
Yeah, it's really awkward, yeah.
And I guess if you're putting a podcast together where you're just sourcing voice notes, you're even more susceptible to that challenge.
Oh, 100%.
What's the worst piece of podcasting advice you ever got?
Oh, I think someone told me once to commit, externally commit. So basically announce stuff before it's actually come about and it will hold you accountable. But I think that was literally my biggest anxiety. When I did that, I was like, oh my God. And the reality is that no one remembers, no one cares, right? But in my head, I was like, oh my God, everyone's waiting for this podcast and I cannot be bothered to make it. And it's so stressful.
Why did the podcast die?
It's actually really sad. I think about it a lot. Isn't that really wild? I literally think about my dead podcast so much. It is my Roman Empire. It died because I literally couldn't be bothered. I just couldn't be bothered to do it anymore. I wanted to do it. If I had a sponsor, if I'd had funds, I would have hired an editor to do it, and I would have genuinely continued doing it probably until today, but I just couldn't be fucked.
Is it just the energy and the effort of the editing, or the lack of results? Because if you'd have had a sponsor, or it had been getting 1 million downloads an episode, you would have carried on. Is that right?
I would be quitting my job and doing that instead. Absolutely. I had loads of feedback from people being like, I absolutely love this format. I love this idea. I love what you're doing. It's interesting. I'm interested in it. And that was the best possible thing for me. But yeah, I think it's without someone else holding me accountable to do it, I think I just can't do it. My self-motivation anyway, in general, is quite low. And I am genuinely quite an ADHD character in the way that I jump from project to project and I go full pelt into whatever that project is. I become obsessed with it, but only for a period of time, and then I have to move on to something else. And I think this is one of those projects I just lost interest in.
And I think that's a very typical story for podcasters.
Yeah, definitely.
You didn't stop at the beginning and make a plan and work out how it was going to pay for itself and how you were going to market it and how it might grow and what might happen if it got a bit boring and those kinds of things. And therefore, you go full tilt until you there's a very sharp learning curve at the beginning. And then when that begins to plateau and the results don't keep going up, I guess that's when people fall off.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that learning piece is really important as well, because I get a dopamine hit, a huge dopamine hit from learning something new. And when I've learned that process, I'm like, okay, next. I want the next, I want something else to learn now. And I think that's it. I almost hit a learning ceiling. And I was like, wow.
How did you know it was the end?
I didn't really. I think that's why I kept paying for Simplecast for 2 years, because I was like, maybe it'll come back. And then at some point I had to be like, Sam, it's not coming back.
Was there a clean cut, or was it a painful breaking up with a partner where you keep going back and don't actually say this is the end?
Yeah, that is literally it. That's also my pattern in relationships in general, I'd say, so this makes sense.
There wasn't a, this is finite, I'm stopping at this episode. It's I'll just do one more. Just do one more. Is that how it was?
This is exactly, that's exactly it. I didn't really know when to stop. I should have stopped. I should have announced that it had stopped. I just left it there and then people kept asking. I was like, yeah, it'll come back, and then it never did.
What are some of the worst decisions you made when making the podcast?
Doing it by myself, I think, was a big a big error, because I think no one was holding me accountable, but also there was no one there to like help share the edit with. I think the way what I've learned about myself is that I either like to edit and then send it to someone else who is like obliged to listen to it essentially, and then gives me feedback so that I can tweak it, or someone else is editing it, they send it to me, and then I essentially act as like the like producer, right? I'd prefer to be the producer, to be honest. But I just wasn't in that position. I had to be editor, interviewer, or whatever, or non-interviewer, but collector.
I don't think most people do. I don't have the
I had to do
abilities to
everything
be
myself,
all
and
the
I don't have the abilities
in
to
a
do
podcast.
that.
You realise once you're in it how many different roles there are to play, aren't there? How many different hats there are.
So many. And also like when you've published it, like that's even another thing where it's like you begin to feel guilty about not promoting it enough. You're like, oh my god, I should be promoting it, and then you're like, but I also have a full-time job. And it's like the pressure is quite a lot of pressure. If you're going to create content, you have to be prepared to promote that content on whatever platform is appropriate. And the annoying thing about podcasts is it's audio, so it's often not designed or perfect for a platform like Instagram or TikTok to be promoted on, because like it's audio. I think one of the things that I didn't quite work out from the podcast is how do I promote it? And that is a huge issue.
What about good decisions that you made too late? Was there anything that you did towards the end? You were like, oh, I wish I'd done this sooner.
I actually really liked the format of getting one person to send in a long voice note and essentially turn it into a podcast. I think that was actually really fun because you really got into the story of it. You got into the story of what they were, the challenges they were facing, like the emotion of it. And I think that was a really good format, and maybe I should have started with that. But then I do think, the format that I chose was unusual because I like an unusual format. And so actually I don't actually have any regrets, I don't think, about the way that I conducted it. And it was an organic thing that just organically grew and changed slightly.
If I had been working with you or producing it, I think I would have worked on sooner. That you see in the titles that you made was that in episode 1, it's just like, tell me what's going on in your life, send me some voice notes. But then by episode 20, it's become much more specific. You kind of niched down and down and down in topic as you went through, because I think subconsciously you learned that the more niche I am and the more specific about the voice notes, the easier this is going to become. Because at the beginning few episodes, when you listen to them, they kind of ping pong around a bit. But by the end, it's like, tell me about your experiences specifically with, COVID and coping with the illness or whatever it is.
No, that's so interesting. I hadn't noticed that, and you are so right. Like I ended up doing ones where it was like, tell me about what your predictions are for travel. Like, how is COVID going to affect travel?
Which is a really niche topic, right? Which puts a whole episode on one thing. Whereas at the beginning, it was just like, tell me anything. And from an audience perspective, you kind of know then, do I want to know or hear people's predictions around travel rather than this podcast could be about anything in the next 20 minutes.
Oh my God, a wild card.
Which, if you carried on, would have become more and more powerful because you would have been able to map out topics and take people on a journey across multiple episodes.
I think that's actually what my original kind of intention for it was when I was, picturing myself on that London Podcast Festival stage talking about my podcast. In my head, it was like, I would be able to, look back in 5 years' time and be like, did any of these predictions actually come true? Like these people, everyday people, none of them are experts necessarily in anything. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, are the conversations that people are having at home, like, are they accurate predictions? Do we need experts in essence to be able to predict things about COVID? Probably not, because we're all kind of living through it. We're all experiencing it. So all of us have very valid, very coherent perspectives and predictions that we could be making. I just thought in my head, I was like, that would be an amazing thing to be able to do in 5 years' time, look back and be like, oh my God, like 40% of these actually came true.
And what about marketing? What did you actually do for marketing?
Oh, well, like my logic was like Twitter.
One of the things about the show that's really clever is that in order to make the show, you sort of need to do marketing to crowdsource the content.
Yeah.
then make
Yeah.
it, and then market it again. So you kind of have to market both ends of it. And there's a really good, I guess, gauge, which you can probably speak to better than me, which is if you put out a topic or a theme you want answers to, you'll get different levels of responses, and that will probably tell you how popular the episode will or won't be. So you're kind of doing market research before you've even started the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And also everyone who's involved in the podcast, they all promote it as well. So like that was actually a really good kind of a complete accident. I did not plan on that happening. I did not realize that's what was going to happen, but that was really helpful that they were all promoting it. I promoted it on Twitter and I promoted it on LinkedIn because lots of people are pulling in predictions about, you know, what work is, because no one was going into work. Everyone was banned from going into offices. So like lots of people were talking about that. Lots of people were talking about how their jobs have been affected, you know, like all that stuff. So it felt like an appropriate platform, actually, LinkedIn, because lots of the content was around work. But actually, yeah, it was really helpful having other people who were so, you know, because there were sometimes like 20 people involved in making an episode. So they would all be promoting it. And that was good.
So did you mourn its passing, or were you relieved to see it die?
I did mourn it, you know, like I am a confession. I hate reading. I love listening to podcasts. Like podcast is my form of reading. I absorb information better. So I think being someone that was like creating a podcast, it's like someone who reads loads of books wants to be an author, right? Like I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be a podcast person. You know, it was so exciting to me. And I just felt really like this is something that a format that I love consuming. I want to contribute, you know, and when it just like didn't, I think that's why I really struggled to let go of it as well. Cause I was like, I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed being part of that kind of podcaster community and making something and putting it up there and having people listen to it. Like I did mourn it, and I really struggled to let go of it, I think, for a really long time. And I will never say never. I mean, well, we'll get to that later, I imagine. But like, I don't, I mean, maybe, I don't know. It's sad, isn't it? When you put a lot of time and effort into creating something and then basically you kind of take it down from the internet and you're like, nah, that's a shame.
If you had to do this again, from everything you've learnt, what one piece of advice would you give to your future self starting a new podcast or bringing it back from the dead?
I would say only do it when you have enough money to hire an editor.
So don't try to do it all yourself.
Yeah, like that's exactly it. Don't try and do everything. I'd say work smart, not hard.
It's interesting. The have a go era of podcasting, or the have a go era of content, feels like it's kind of running out. And the big results from just let me, you know, stick something on the internet and maybe I'll get lucky, those days are numbered, and it's very unlikely that's going to work. But during COVID, I think when you started the podcast, it very much was the height of the have a go era. So I think, you know, it's a good piece of advice.
It's so saturated now. I think we've gone on a bit of a pendulum swing, didn't we? And we went all the way this way, and now we're very much coming back to the middle, and it's like moderation and moderation. If people are consuming moderately and people are creating moderately, then it means that you are far less likely to be an overnight success, and it's just going to take off like that.
If your podcast had a headstone, what would you put on it?
Oh my God, that's such a hard question. The thing is, this would be an in-joke, okay? But I don't think it would work. Basically, my business partner, May, who I run my company with on an everyday basis, right? So she's like a designer. She's incredibly good at design. She designs everything for our company, Eric. I asked her to design a thumbnail for me, and it's like, you know, a kind of ocean background, like it's an aerial shot of the sea, and then it has in quite clear block letters what the world thinks, okay? And May's first version, that was her design, it is beautiful. Her first version, she missed out the I in thinks. So for like a year, neither of us noticed. So it was what the world thinks.
I think that would be perfect on a headstone. That's amazing. Just
I would have that on
thunks.
there. Yeah, yeah, thanks.
That's a great story as well. I love that.
Oh my god! Also, no one else seemed to notice. I don't think anyone noticed. So maybe that just goes to show how little people listen to the podcast.
I won't comment.
Very diplomatic of you, James.
So I guess it's kind of that time where we have to think about a judgment on whether this podcast should be resurrected or should it stay buried forever. And I have to say that I love the idea. I love the idea of crowdsourced content, of giving a voice to other people's thoughts, to basically what you've done is you've kind of made audio Twitter, but curated on a different topic every episode. And from a concept perspective, I absolutely think it should be resurrected. However, for me, it would need more specific direction, because especially in a world where niching and specializing is becoming more of a thing all the time, and most social media works on the interest graph now, not the follower graph, so you're following themes rather than people, it would become increasingly difficult to build any kind of community around just like a podcast that's just about whatever you feel like this episode. So I love the format. I'm not such a fan of its open, unstructured nature. But if you were to add some kind of theme or topic or niche or subculture around that concept, I think it could be huge. And I absolutely love the bringing in the audience and the idea that you're kind of testing the episode when you're collecting the content before you've even put it out. And I feel like from a production company standpoint, or if you were going to turn this into a business venture, I feel like there's so much data and insight you could draw from making the podcast. It would be a great podcast for a market research company where they pull in all the information and then they put out the audio, but out of the back of that, you create insights and reports and, sell data. I know that sounds terrible, but that's how business works. And so I feel like that would be really interesting. But in its format of just what do I feel like talking about today, then I'd probably leave it where it is now. How do you feel about that? Does that feel fair?
That was an emotional roller coaster for me. I was like, it's coming back, it's dying, it's coming back, it's dead.
It's a fantastic concept. It's simple but powerful. The way you've delivered it from a production perspective, you give an intro, you give an outro, it's other people's opinion in the middle. You could boost that with a bit more, you could add some more signposts in the middle of you talking if you wanted. I love that. It's different, and I think the non-interview format is just going to grow and grow. But it needs to be grounded in some kind of North Star. Will we see its resurrection?
Do you know what? I actually, doing this interview has made me be like, I really loved doing that podcast. This is the trap that I fall into, though. It's like, oh, fun project. And then I'll get bored of it. But I would love to bring it back. It is I think at the end of the day, you create stuff that you would want to listen to or see or do whatever yourself, that you would want to consume yourself. And I absolutely, as a consumer, would have loved to consume that podcast. And so, there's always something in me that's like, oh yeah, I want to bring it back because it's the kind of thing I would want to listen to. So I would say never. When I become rich, which will be in probably after I die, then I think I would be able to do it. But I can't see right now how I would be able to do it because my day job is so busy. I actually am also a yoga teacher, so I have another job as well. And so adding another job on, podcast host, would just mean that I would basically have no life.
Too much.
Yeah. So I'll wait until I, sell my business at some point. And then hopefully I'll be able to.
On that note, thank you so much for reflecting on the life and times of your podcast. And I'm glad that we've given it a proper send-off.
I feel so flattered that you asked me here, James. And thank you so much for letting me talk about what the world thinks for so long.
Thank you.